Sharbel, which is the name that he took as a monk, was born in 1828 and died at the end of that century, 1898. He was a good example of someone who used the means of grace in the context in which he was born. Lebanon is, and was especially, a country of great spiritual cross-section and cross-fertilization. A big French influence there. But these would have been of the ancient rite of the Maronites, but united to Rome, which explains how he could be canonized in Rome. And when Blessed Paul VI decided to beatify him at the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council, it was an indication of the importance of this figure, given that the Second Vatican Council was the one that helped us to see the wider picture with regard to the larger Christian family in which we are inserted, and that we have more in common with our brethren across the Christian globe than what actually divides us. This then is the backdrop to the beatification and the subsequent canonization of this prodigy of healing. Immediately when he died, without speaking of what happened during his life, miracles were multiplied, and people, not only Catholics, but also even Muslims, would come and obtain instant healing by the use of this miraculous oil which oozed and still comes from the body of the dead saint. Because he was in the ambit of the Uniates, they're the ones of Eastern Rite but under Rome, was also influenced by the good side of the Latin practice. That is the more developed Eucharistic life that we have in the West than in the East. Therefore, we find him celebrating daily Mass, and we also find him in adoration, things which are not that common really in the East. It's more developed in the West. Indeed, this was the center of his very austere life, and it was austere on the top of that mountain. No comfort whatsoever. And it is not by accident that it was during the celebration of the sacred mysteries himself that he had to stop. He was taken ill. It seems he had a stroke. He came down from the altar, his own simple altar, but then he wasn't going to leave it there, and later in the day he returned to the point that he'd left and tried to carry on. And so it is in the process of celebrating that he actually died. It's rather similar to Padre Pio in a sense, for until very close to his death we find him at the altar. He was actually filmed. It's also something much earlier that we find in the Reformation period. Our own local martyr, John Roberts, a Benedictine, was caught in his robes. Open up in the name of the king. And they insisted, and no answer, so they banged down the door. He was at that point at the last gospel, so he was taken robes and all, and hanged, drawn and quartered a few days later at Tyburn, 1610. Therefore a martyr of the Eucharist itself. This saint had in his life a huge force of attraction. He was charitable, and he was extremely generous, even actually as a child. Hidden sacrifices. People just knew his goodness, and that drew. But in asking permission to go from the cenobium, the monastery itself, up the mountain to the property that they possessed, the hermitage, and obtaining it, he knew what it involved. And actually the reading that the Church gives us on this day for his feast at the Office of Readings, vigils, indicates from another author, not himself, the radical nature of that choice, and that much is expected of one who opts for that. Otherwise, it's a parasite situation. One is a parasite of the Church, and therefore a radicality of being a living sacrifice, a lamp consuming itself day and night, is there, and not consoling oneself with what actually might take its place. And that actually can happen. By the way, it concerns anyone here who might be, through force of circumstances, in a similar situation initially without choosing it. A widow or a widower, finding an unexpectedly early widowhood in which one can choose which way to go. Indeed, it was heard after the death of, I think it was Elizabeth of Hungary, these three words: marriage does not exclude from heaven, widowhood draws the soul closer to God, virginity merits the crown. And therefore that second part was close to a refound virginity and was a potential mode of eremitic life if the soul entered into the proposition of grace that the Lord was offering. That could concern anyone here suddenly who loses a partner, because solitude then hits, and what many a soul will do at that point will be to avoid it and miss the invitation of grace. That other bit, that second bit, that middle bit, which St. Elizabeth heard, widowhood draws the soul closer to God, is something that has to be worked upon. It means in practice not excluding the intimacy that solitude provides. Because if one opts not to have solitude by, e.g., filling the day with a voice, which is easily available all the time, then one does not enter into the adventure. One cancels it, and one will find an immediate company which will not satisfy, and eventually will come back to roost, because the person will not know why there is dissatisfaction, because an artificial voice does not fulfill. There is no communion of soul, whereas the Lord met in that solitude, waiting for that soul with his own consolation, does. One does find many a soul who does understand the game, and many heroic souls who reach true sanctity in widowhood. They use the available time, which is huge, to read, to say the rosary, to do adoration, in a word, to become the intimate friend of the Sacred Heart. It can be done. The same can apply actually to a soul who is not really a widow or widower, but nevertheless, for no fault of its own, can find itself in a situation of unchosen solitude. A marriage which has been messed up, that can happen. And therefore the soul has to find in that new modality, first of all after the shock of finding that it's not fulfilled as it was meant to be, the possibility of becoming, yes, a saint. There is also, strangely enough, the situation of the soul in a marriage who finds the marriage is extremely dysfunctional. And then one has the choice. Will one stay there or will one just leave it? Well, many nowadays just opt for the second, and very quickly, forgetting the great army of holy women, St. Rita of Cassia, Elizabeth of Portugal, Queen, and many, many, many hidden saints here and there who have become great saints in a very dysfunctional marriage. We know, for instance, how St Elizabeth of Portugal even paid for the education of the illegitimate children coming from her unfaithful husband, who was good to them, and stayed in the marriage. Eventually her husband died, and then she was able to consecrate herself to the Lord directly. Often, the proposition of sanctity is just there where we are. And wanting at all costs to go physically elsewhere can be a way of avoiding the grace actually there. Often we are the problem, or part of the problem. And if we work on ourselves, we don't need then to go elsewhere. Because if one goes elsewhere and the problem is not solved, all that one finds is the problem again, but in a different geographic setting, because we are the problem. We have to work on the cards that we have in our hands and not change them. Now that can mean actually what we don't want to do, acceptance of the divine will as it manifests itself, and as it shouldn't manifest itself, so we think, because we think better. But we only have actually the present moment in its present form. All the rest is illusion. And in that, this saint has something to teach us all. It's this: that intimacy with the Lord has its conditions, and they're fairly radical conditions. The Lord dislikes complication and favours simplicity. The Lord dislikes many words and is at home in a few well-meant ones. The Lord dislikes high decibels and is at home in stillness, physical and audible. That actually applies even to the body. And therefore the soul that inhabits a body which does not run through life or do violent actions all the time, but is calm, that soul also, because intimately linked with all that the body does, is calm. And in that soul, the soul finds God much more easily, because God is a calm God. Now this matters if we want to pick up what the Lord is actually saying, because he does have ways and means of communicating. Initially, the most obvious one, and the most immediate one, and the most concrete one, is that precisely of what he's saying right now in the present moment as it's coming to me, the event. Because providence is historic, and the will of God is there, right now, in the person that comes to me here and now, not programmed. So I don't push that grace away, wanting another one which I think to be superior. That gives calm, by the way, because there's no overreaction. The soul that has wedded the will of God is at peace in any form of manifestation of the will of God, including the unprepared. I know a priest who is extremely ordered, and everything is very well prepared and works perfectly until the unexpected happens. And he can't cope so easily with the unexpected and has strange reactions. Interesting. One has to be always, in some way, in a form of abdication, so that we don't actually rule, we accept the moment as it presents itself, and we rest upon it. And in it, as it presents itself, we find our sanctification. It's the same moment, but we handle it with peace. We don't collide with the moment, we don't push back the event. We say fiat to the angel coming in that form. One last point. This saint, as many of the hidden saints of the Church, while they were alive, only really came to the fore after he died. Curé Vaz, St Jean-Marie Vianney, always refused to appear in any pose of a picture. Padre Pio also refused until he was ordered to appear on a picture. Well, something of that also existed here. pictures did exist by 1898, and there was not one of him. One day, a group of pilgrims went to the place where he had lived, on the top of the mountain, and they took a group photo on what happened. When it was developed, the hitherto unphotographed saint appeared as the extra pilgrim. So this is the sense of humour of heaven. And we too found the same thing actually locally in Wales with that other saint of the Mass, St John Roberts, our local Benedictine saint. If one applied the relic which we had of him, sometimes things would happen. I remember hearing this from the family that had the care of the church. The lady there was in terrible, terrible pain and said to her son-in-law, because she couldn't take any more, "Harry, do something." And so something nudged Harry to go down to the church and get the relic and rub it against the hurting part. And from that moment until she died, there was not another ground.